I first met Barney Cooney back in about the early 1980s when I was an active member of the Labor Party, and he was a barrister who was also very active in the Labor Party, reasonably prominent. And I got on the administrative committee of the party in Victoria in 1983, and he was also a member of that committee. Every now and then he used to give me a lift home because he lived in Elstonwick, I was living in Elwood, and he, through an odd sequence of events, was pre-selected for a winnable spot on the Labor Party Senate ticket. And as he was driving me home on a Friday night a few days after this, he said, "Look, if you've got any ideas about a bright young thing who could come and work with me on my staff when I take office as a senator, because I think I'm going to win, that'd be really good." And I said, yeah, no problems. I was working as a junior lawyer at the time. And I thought about this over the weekend, and I was reaching a point in my legal career where I was going to have to choose, that I had such a heavy set of commitments in the political world that I was in a point where I had to scale them back dramatically and get serious about becoming more senior as a lawyer, or alternatively get some more full-time or serious role in the political world. So I rang Barney up on the Monday and said, yeah, I've got a suggestion for you, me. And he said, oh, that's great, we'll come down and have a chat. And so we had a bit of a chat, and he more or less said, well, look, I don't care what you do, you can go and lie on a beach if you like, as working for me, but I want this position to be an opportunity for somebody to develop. And I did all sorts of things in the 2 years I worked with him. I was heavily involved in organising a reform group in a union, and the reason I left Barney's employ a couple of years later was that I was successful, much to my own surprise and everybody else's, in getting elected as a union official in the Clerks' Union, as it then was, against the existing ruling group. But over that time, I learnt a great deal of Barney as an extraordinarily compassionate, wise and decent man, and a very unusual politician. Very little ego, very strongly committed to a set of values that he believed in, and very, very committed to helping people, not only as a group but also as individuals. So he was notoriously absent-minded and shambolic, and his office was a complete nightmare. His filing system I used to describe as grabbing hold of a huge pile of papers and throwing them up in the air in the hope that the one he wanted would actually land on top. So he had a rather disorganised approach to his work and to life generally, but an absolute heart of gold and a deep sense of long-term Labor values, and a really strong commitment to people, both as individuals and as wider groups. So he would have struggling people who would come into his office very often, and he would pay their phone bills, he would do all kinds of things to help them, and would give as much of his time as they demanded in order to assist them. And to me, that taught me a great lesson, not only about compassion, but also about empathy, and about the fact that ultimately, no matter what kind of representative role you're in, you are dealing with individuals, and you have an obligation not just to some theoretical group of people, but also to the individuals that you are representing. And so I learned some great lessons from Barney to balance out what you might call the big picture, theoretical kind of political practice that everybody in politics has to some degree, with a compassion and a commitment for helping individuals deal with their problems. And many of the people that he had to deal with, and I had to deal with, given the nature of the area that we were representing, were people with a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, and in some cases very, very difficult to deal with. So I learned some great lessons there about how to be a representative and how to treat people with respect and dignity, and to treat their problems as the most important things that I had to deal with. And in retrospect, probably almost the most satisfying element of my political career was the large number of individuals that I was involved in providing some kind of assistance or comfort to over that time. And the fact that there are people out there for whom the work that I did for them matters a great deal still, even though its implications for the wider world are negligible. I've had people yell out to me in the street 10 or 15 years after I've helped them with an immigration case or a drama with Centrelink or whatever, who have never forgotten that small bit of assistance I've given them. And to me, that's possibly the most satisfying feature of my extended political career. And I learnt to value that from Barney Cooney, and I learnt to understand that as a representative, your primary obligation is ultimately to individuals, and that there is nothing more important than doing everything you can to help individuals. And I had a great experience one day while I was working for Barney, where he shared an office with Jerry Hand, who was also a great mentor of mine. And this was in the mid-1980s. There was a lot of turmoil within the Labor Party, a lot of realignment going along, and a very, very senior figure in the labour movement broadly, not a member of the Labor Party, but somebody who had a lot of influence in the union world and was quite an iconic figure, was having a meeting with Jerry about these realignments and trying to persuade him to go along with this and be part of it. And I was there as an up-and-coming minor mover and shaker at this meeting. There were only about 3 or 4 of us there. And the meeting went on for a while, and this guy was very enthusiastic and really pumping up things. And Jerry said, "Oh, look, sorry, I've got to go now. I've got a constituent, I've got a pensioner downstairs, I've got to help out." You know, and the person we were dealing with said, "Oh, look, this is not about pensioners. The pensioner can wait. You know, we're dealing with the future of the labour movement," and all this kind of airy-fairy stuff. And Jerry, to his great credit, said, "No, I'm going down to look after this pensioner. That is more important. That is where my responsibilities lie." And that was the same message that I got working for Barney Cooney, reinforced in a really stark way, that ultimately you cannot avoid your responsibilities as a representative to do your best for the individual who is there seeking assistance from you. Now, I went on to be a colleague of Barney Cooney's because, of course, subsequently, some years later, while he was still a member of the Labor caucus, and I became a member as well in 1993. So by the time I got there, he'd been there for about 9 years, and I then shared an office with him because, of course, Jerry Hand was the person I succeeded as the member for Melbourne. He was sharing an office with Barney. I succeeded Jerry. I then shared an office with Barney, and there were a lot of great times, a lot of fun times, a lot of difficult challenges, and an incredible amount of learning for me about how to fulfil your obligations as a representative of people with compassion and with some degree of wisdom and balance and a sense of decency that I can't say to what extent I lived up to that role model, to that example that Barney set, but it was a shining example for me, and I always used to refer young people in the Labor Party to him for advice about their future and how to go about becoming more prominent and more committed in the Labor Party. He was one of those classic quiet achievers who contributed a huge amount to the Labor Party, rarely troubled the scorers on the media front, but was the heart and soul of what is good about the Victorian Labor Party. And to conclude my, I suppose, learning and education, both working for Barney and with Barney, I want to finish with a small moment that happened to me after I'd been in Parliament for probably about 7 or 8 years, that really underlined the importance of compassion as a political representative in this country and the importance of understanding just how privileged most Australians are, how fortunate we are in this country, and how much of an obligation we have got to do everything we can to help other people in other parts of the world, many of whom are a lot less fortunate than us. Something that many of us, I think, fail to realise, fail to understand, and we tend to be inward looking and we tend to shut out some of the more uncomfortable realities of the wider world. We get very agitated about things like asylum seekers coming by boat to Australia, overlooking the world that they've come from, the realities they have to deal with, and just how well off the society they're seeking to be part of actually is in practice. This moment occurred in Adelaide, and I was at a small function for a Labor candidate, and there was an old Greek wharfie there, a bloke who'd come to Australia in the late 1940s, was retired now. He'd been a wharfie for, I think, decades, and I was chatting with him, and because I was very interested in Greek things, and I was learning Greek, the language. I was asking him all kinds of questions, and I asked him, how did you come to migrate to Australia? He said in response 7 words that I've never forgotten. He just said, my mother and sister died of starvation. And this really knocked me out, because the reality that brought home is that throughout our modern history as a nation, many of the people who have come here as migrants, as refugees, have come from appalling circumstances that we simply cannot contemplate. Those of us who've been fortunate enough to grow up in Australia, and it really was a message that was imprinted on my mind from then on, and that is that before we get too agitated as a people, as a society, about others who are less fortunate than ourselves seeking to come here, and in some cases doing so in relatively unorthodox ways, we should always remember what they are often coming from, the unbelievable poverty, warfare and trauma that is often the backdrop to their desire to move to Australia, and contrast that with the extraordinarily privileged, secure lives that we typically get to lead. This guy didn't bat an eyelid when he said to me, my mother and my sister died of starvation. That was just a matter-of-fact explanation of, well, of course I had to leave Greece, because otherwise I was going to be there not only at risk of dying, my father also came, but the people around me, they were actually dying. We lose sight of these things, and we tend to close our hearts to the realities that exist out there. We should be less selfish. We should, both in our own self-interest and in our own self-respect, should do more to help people like him. We have a good track record, but it could be better.